One of the best things about food is how it connects us to different places and different cultures. And pies, well, pies are all over the world in some shape or form. In England, you got a pork pie. In the US, you got sweet pies like apple and blueberry. And in Australia, we love a meat pie from the servo. But for me, the ultimate pie comes from my home country of New Zealand, the steak and cheese pie. There's something about that meaty beef, the creamy cheese, and the flaky pastry that, for me at least, makes it the king of pies. It's rich, comforting, and packed full of flavor, and today I'm gonna show you how to make one that'll rival the best bakeries in New Zealand. But I think we can level this up by using a secondary cut of beef, the beef cheek. Beef cheeks are full of delicious gelatinous texture. When it's slowly cooked, they break down and become super juicy and tender. We're also gonna make our own pastry and use a really nice cheddar to throw in there. A huge thank you to Australian Beef for sponsoring this video. Let's get stuck in. So, the beef cheek. Why is it so good for braising? Well, if you think about a cheek, what it does as a muscle is it chews, and cows chew all day. So this muscle works a lot, which means it has an amazing flavor and it builds up a lot of that gelatinous stuff that we like to break down in long braises. The very best place, and probably the only place I'll ever buy beef cheeks from, is the butcher, because you're not gonna find them anywhere else, to be perfectly honest. And more importantly, your butcher's gonna be able to talk you through what cheeks they've got in stock. This is an Angus beef cheek, as opposed to like a Wagyu, whatever preference you like. I like these ones because I like the flavor. But like I said, go talk to your butcher, they'll be able to help you out. So what we do need to do is to get rid of a lot of the silver skin. This stuff won't break down. We're gonna take a sharp boning knife like this. You want something with a pointy end, nothing too flexible. You're gonna pierce the piece of silver skin, push it through. You're gonna tilt your blade, I'm gonna exaggerate this, but you're gonna tilt your blade slightly up and then push it through. And that means that we're not gonna get anywhere near as much of the flesh underneath. So keep pushing through and cut through. Now, I encourage you to do this stuff yourself because I think it's a great way to learn a little bit about what you're doing at home. But definitely, if this kind of thing intimidates you or you're just a bit short on time, talk to your butcher. They'll definitely be able to do this stuff for you. You'll also find in a lot of shops that these will already come trimmed. They'll already have this fat cap off, because we need to take this off as well. There's a lot of big piece of silver skin under here, and we don't want a lot of like top fat like you would if you're smoking meat or something like that, because all that's going to do is just cloudy up your braising liquid. You can see the color. Look at that ruby dark red color. So just continue all the way around on the top. I'm going to pull this fat cap off. I'm going to pull all this silver skin off. The other good thing about practicing removing silver skin on a piece of meat like this, instead of like a ribeye or a sirloin or something like that, is that we're going to dice it up afterwards. So it's a good thing to practice on, because if you kind of hack at it a little bit because you're still learning, it doesn't really matter, we're going to dice it anyway. General rule of thumb, if anything feels hard, it's probably not going to break down very easy. So that's all scraps. You can use that for making stock and sauce, or you can feed it to your dog. I actually just vac packed all that stuff and I'll put it in my freezer, and then when next time I'm making a sauce, I'll use some of that. Now for the ultimate steak and cheese pie, I think you need a large-ish dice. You want this to still have some hold. Now this is a great example. This is what we're after. All this connective tissue here, with slow cooking, this breaks down and goes delicious and gelatinous. So this is the sort of dice that I think you want, around a 2 centimeter square, give or take. There you go. Repeat with everything else, and then we'll get into the veggies. So there it is, our beautiful beef cheek meat. And like I was saying, I think it's a great way to do it yourself. Great thing to do yourself, but if you don't want to, talk to your butcher, and I'm sure they can get it to this point for you as well. Just gonna give it a light seasoning with cooking salt and just leave it out for it to kind of, I'm hesitant to call it a dry brine because it's only gonna be out for about 20 minutes, but just a good way to season it evenly. Then I'm gonna wash my board down and we'll get the veggies ready. So the classic murupā, I'm gonna peel our onions and then we're gonna dice them. Now we don't want them too small, we don't want them to disintegrate. We want some onion in there as well. Similar with the carrots, we're gonna peel these and dice them around 1 centimeter cubes. Celery, we can go a little bit smaller. We're just kind of there for the earthy flavor. I'm gonna use a whole head of garlic. This will soften out. You're not gonna taste strong garlic flavor. We're gonna smash them, peel them, and finally dice them all. All right, and finally, we need some herbs. We've got some rosemary, it's fresh from my garden. Some thyme. I was very excited about that, wasn't I? I should have a bay leaf in there somewhere. Stunning. So pretty simple. The thyme's pretty young, so I'm not even gonna pick that, to be perfectly honest. Rosemary, pull the stems out. Thyme, run our knife through. Same with the rosemary leaves. Got our beef, got our murupā, let's get cooking. That was so All right, got our beef and our murupā to the stove. I've got a cast iron pan here over a medium heat, and we're gonna seal this off in beef tallow. You can get beef tallow from your butcher as well, and it's a great oil or fat to seal meat off because it's obviously natural, but it also tastes like beef, just amplifies that beefy flavor. Your butchers will definitely sell beef tallow in little jars. Has a really high smoking point too. So once that is smoking, get your beef in there. We're gonna get some decent color on all sides. I also like to kind of work around in a circle, and that way you know where you kind of started. So I started at this pointy end, and you know I can start turning from that point around, and they all have the same amount of time on each side. So it's really important that we work in batches with the beef cheeks, seal them off, good color on each side, then place them in the vessel you're gonna cook your pie mix in. Now you could use a Dutch oven, or you can use a gastro tray like I'm gonna do and cover it with foil. Once all your meat is nicely browned and into your vessel you're cooking it in, you're gonna start sweating off the veggies. First things first, a bit more beef tallow into the pan and start sauteing off your carrots and onions. A pinch of salt, 3 or 4 minutes just to get some color. Next, add your celery, then your garlic, bay leaf and herbs. Stir that through before adding the tomato puree. Follow the tomato puree by adding some red wine. It's also going to give you liquid to help you distribute the tomato puree through the rest of it. Once all that's come together, pour that over your beef from earlier, then place your pan back on the heat and add your beef stock. Now you can either make your own beef stock by going to your butcher and buying some bones, recipe above, or just buy your beef stock from the butcher, because any good butcher will sell good stock as well. Add the stock to the pan and bring it up to a simmer. All we're doing is getting it hot before we pour it over the rest of our meat. Mix that really well. Then you're going to add a piece of parchment paper to the top, followed by 2 layers of foil. Why do we add the parchment paper? Well, it protects the meat from the foil during the cooking process. Into the oven, 160 degrees for 3 hours. So while our beef is in the oven, we're going to make our pastry. This is, I guess, a shortcut pastry, pretty standard recipe. Flour, just all-purpose flour will work. This is actually like a cake flour, which is a slightly lower protein, means you're gonna get a bit of a better mouthfeel and crumb. So you can either use all-purpose or use something like a cake flour. Butter, cold butter and cubed into a food processor. If you don't have a food processor, you can do this by hand. What you do is you're gonna put it into a bowl and you're gonna run it through your fingers. As soon as you feel the butter start melting, stop, put it in the fridge, come out, keep going. And then you need to get it to the same consistency. Definitely possible, just a lot easier with a food processor. Oh, almost forgot. Pinch of salt. So we're going to cut that butter into that flour. We're pretty close. I can feel with my fingers that the temperature's still cold, which is what you want. You don't want this to get too hot. You don't want the butter to melt. And if you are using a food processor, I think it's easier to pulse instead of just turning on and leaving it. Usually means you get a more even consistency of your butter through your flour. Cool, that's exactly what we're looking for. You're looking for the same consistency if you're just doing this by hand. Feels like almond meal or like very coarse flour. You shouldn't feel any large pieces of butter. So all we need is a little bit of ice cold water to bring this together. So I've got lots of ice and water in here. I'm just gonna pour in about a tablespoon and we'll see how that comes. We only want just enough water for that to turn into a dough. A little bit more. Kind of don't really want cubes of ice in there, ideally. It's getting close. You can clump it together and it comes together, but I'm gonna go a little bit more. You can hear it, and you can see it starting to clump together. It's pretty close, a little touch more. And as soon as it stops moving so fast like that, and it's starting to ball up in there, that is what we're looking for. Okay, I've just felt there's still a bit of a wet spot in there, so I'm just gonna break it up just to make sure that we have that water really nicely distributed. I'm gonna add a touch more, literally a teaspoon. It's really hard to give you a measurement for that amount of water. I think you have to do it by feel. Start with 1 or 2 tablespoons and then go from there. Clean bench, just a light dusting of flour. Dunk. Gonna bring that dough together. We're not trying to knead this dough. We're just trying to bring it together into one homogeneous, my favorite word, piece of dough. So just keep working it. Again, it shouldn't feel warm. It should feel not cold to the touch, but it should be colder than room temperature, if that makes sense. And then we want to try and form kind of a disc shape. And why we do a disc shape is so that tomorrow when we roll this out, we're already starting with something that resembles the shape that we're trying to roll out. So it's going to make our rolling experience tomorrow a bit easier. We need to rest this, ideally overnight. If you're going to do this all in the same day, like I was talking about earlier, you're going to need to leave it in the fridge for at least 2 to 3 hours, ideally 4. There's no reason why you couldn't wake up in the morning and do this first thing and roll it out in the afternoon. So we need to cover it. We can either use a Ziploc bag or just a piece of cling film. Make sure that there's no air gaps in there at all. Nice and tightly rolled. There you go, there's our pastry made, ready for tomorrow. In the fridge, we're gonna take it out about 20 minutes before we need to roll it tomorrow. 3 hours later, let's have a look-see. Carefully take the foil off. It's gonna be full of steam, so don't burn yourself. This is what you want, still chunky, but falling apart. So we're gonna really carefully pour this out into a colander. Go gentle with it, we don't want to break up the chunky beef. We're just gonna let most of that sauce come out the bottom. So we need to thicken the sauce. We want it to be nice and thick so it sticks to the meat when it's in the pie. And when you cut your pie open, you kind of want it to hold together. Oh, that wasn't just YouTube effects, that's actually delicious. We got the heat on, we just need that simmering lightly. And then here we've got some corn flour and some water. We're just gonna dissolve the corn, we're definitely not gonna need all of that, I've made way too much. We're gonna dissolve the corn flour in the water, and that's what we're gonna use to thicken it. And we want this gravy pretty thick. It's also your last chance to adjust seasoning. So a pinch of salt, don't need much. Make sure you taste it. Dissolve that salt in. Now that that's up to temperature, we can thicken it with our cornstarch. I'm gonna use about half of this. We'll cook it out and we'll see how thick it gets. A little bit more. There we go, that's what we're looking for. Okay, heat off. Fold that meat back through the gravy. Carefully, again, we don't want this to break up. We want nice, chunky beef. Oh, found my bay leaf. Pull that out.
Smells like a proper pie.
Taste it, chef. Don't swear on my YouTube video. I want to know what you think.
Oh, yeah.
All good?
Yeah.
Right answer. Oh, yum. So into a clean container. Get all that goodness out. We're gonna let this cool to kind of room temperature, cover it and place it in the fridge overnight. I think the overnight step's important. You just need it to be cold to put it in the pie, but I think when you deal with braises like this, if you leave them in the fridge overnight for the flavors to kind of hang out together, it does make a big difference. So this is going in the fridge, I'm cleaning this kitchen, and we'll see you tomorrow. Well, good morning. It's a new day, and we have our pastry out, and as you can see, and here, it's rock hard, and that's because the butter's set up, which is perfect, it's what we wanted. But we need this to come to room temperature before we can deal with it. We're gonna use our time wisely, and we're gonna peel our potatoes for a mash that's gonna go with it. So for mash, I love to use these Desiree potatoes. These are kind of nice small ones, usually they're a bit bigger, but they make great mash. So cold water, to be perfectly honest, probably should be a bigger pot than this, but commercial kitchens are funny sometimes. Pots are either this big or this big, there's no in between. Simply peel into water. Cut them in half, because you want them all about the same size. Cold water, pinch of salt, onto the heat.
Simmer your potatoes on a medium to medium-high heat till they're fork tender. Then drain them really well, and then you're going to mash them. You can use a moolie like I'm using, or just your plain old hand masher will work just as well also. And for these potatoes, we are just going to use butter. No milk, no cream. So take your cold cube butter into your mash over the stove on a low heat, and you're going to stir it through with a rubber spoon until that butter is completely emulsified into your mash. It's a very deluxe way of doing it, but you're going to get a really delicious mash. And if you don't want to use all that butter, simply reduce the amount of butter and replace it with a little bit of milk till you get the consistency you're looking for.
So, pastry, probably the trickiest part of this whole recipe. Just take your time, we'll get it right. We're gonna use a classic kind of pie-shaped tin. You could use like a fluted tin if you wanted to. You can even use something like a cake tin, like a springform cake tin. It'll be a lot thicker. This is kind of the classic pie tin shape. I do want it quite fat though, like I want it quite thick, so we're gonna fill it a lot. We need 2 discs. We need one that's gonna line it, and we need one for the top. We're gonna really overshoot for the one that's on the top. It's actually easier if we do that in 2 parts, so we're just gonna cut that quickly. And to be perfectly honest, I should have thought about that when I was rolling this yesterday and rolled it into 2 discs. But alas, here we are. So just cover that other one with the tea towel. So because we've got an uneven shape, we're gonna need to obviously focus on rolling this more this way than this way, because we want a roughly a round disc. So you want a piece of parchment paper. That's gonna make it easier to lift off and put it into our tin when we're ready. A light dusting of flour, both sides. Put a little bit on your rolling pin as well. The rolling pin stuff, just make sure if there's any moisture, that the flour will take care of that. Start pressing it first before you start rolling it. You kind of need to put some muscle into it too. It's not just gonna kind of roll out really easily. So try and use your weight. If you get over the top of it, it's gonna roll it easier. It's a real fine line too. You don't want it, if it's too warm, it's gonna be really hard to roll. It's gonna roll easier, but it's gonna be really hard to get into the tin. If it's too cold, it's hard to roll because the butter's still hard. You also want to do it slowly. You don't want to roll really fast and like flatten it out fast because you're going to have heaps of cracks appear, which is not good. Flip it over as well. As you see, we had heaps of cracks on the top. If we didn't flip it over, we wouldn't know that. Make sure it's not sticking to the paper. That's why we want to use the paper too. It's easier to pull this off paper than it is to pull it off a bench. We'll start thinking about the tin size. So we want a fair amount of overlap here, right? So we want this to come out to about here. So here's good. We need to get this thicker here. We need to get it thicker here because of these cracks that are forming. So you kind of can manipulate those cracks a little bit, but just be careful because you're going to thin the pastry out there at that point, which is not ideal. You want an even thickness of pastry. And if it sticks like that, it means you probably need to put a little bit more flour on it just to stop it from sticking. You don't want heaps of flour. You shouldn't really see it, but it will stop the pastry from sticking. How are we looking? We're getting close. A little bit more that way. If I move that there, we're pretty close there actually. All right, I'm happy with that. Now the tricky part. So we've got a pie tin, we've got a little bit of butter here. You could use oil, spray oil if you wanted to. This is a little bit of clarified butter that I had hanging around. And you don't need heaps of it. It's actually kind of more so to help you get the pastry into the pie as opposed to get the pie out. What we want to do is try and get that onto there. Now, you're going to have to flip it over and put it in. You don't want to slam it down though. You want to kind of carefully lay it on like that. Make sure before you push it in that you give yourself some room. What I mean is while I'm pushing this down, I'm lifting this side up, and that's just not gonna, it's gonna allow the pastry to not crack as it slides in. And this pastry goes from being rock hard to being really delicate in like what, how long has that taken? 10 minutes to roll. We're also not blind baking this pastry, so we do need to make sure that we don't have any cracks in this in the bottom. If you do, make sure that you do kind of close them up really well. Otherwise you're gonna end up with a soggy pie. Okay, at this point, we haven't quite finished pressing that in, but we do want to get some of this excess off because it's weighing down the sides. So leave about 1 centimetre still hanging over and run a knife around it. Work that in there. You want to make sure that's really pressing into the corners. So little tricks, take a bit of the excess pastry off, roll it up into a ball and use that to press. Why? Because it's going to adhere to the form a lot better. It's also not as hot as your fingers. Right now, the enemy of this pastry is actually heat. You don't want the butter to melt, right? That's when we're going to come into issues. So we're just going to push this around once, making sure there's no air bubbles in the bottom. I can see there's an air bubble here. I'm going to make a little cut. I'm going to get that air out, and then I'm going to use my fingers to close that cut up again. This is about as far as I'm willing to take this. I'm going to put this in the fridge, just so that butter doesn't melt anymore. We're gonna do the same thing with that other piece of pastry that we've got left over. You can kind of knead this, rest it and roll it out again. It's not gonna have as a great kind of finish as it would have from this kind of really well rested piece. But same as before, piece of paper, and we're just trying to roll out a disc like before. A little bit of flour. Once we've got this disc rolled, it's going to go in the fridge as well. We'll cut it out, we'll leave it on the paper, put it on a tray into the fridge to rest, and then we'll cut it out once we're ready to put it on our filled pie. So while our pastry shell is resting and chilling in the fridge, cheese, very important. So any cheddar will really work. I like doing a smoked cheddar like this one. So just leave this outside skin on. I think it's got like a lot of the smoked flavor, so don't worry about cutting it off. A couple of ways you can do it. You can either slice it and put it on a slice, but I like to grate it. You're going to get more of a gooey texture. So our pie tin is rested for 20 minutes and it's completely firmed up again, which is exactly what I want. We've got our delicious pie mix from yesterday. Beef cheek pie mix, probably the tastiest secondary cut there is. It's easiest to use a gloved hand to fill a pie like this because you've got more dexterity than if you just try and use a spoon. So take it out and give it a mush and then push it in. We want to get as much pie mix into this as we can. We don't want to be stingy with it. Load her up. And you gotta think there's gonna be a lot of air pockets here too, so we're gonna load it up pretty high, because as that gravy kind of liquefies again, it'll fill all those gaps. Press it down. The other thing we want to avoid is any kind of sharp edges. Feels like a bit of a dramatic way of saying it, but we don't want any kind of pointy bits. Because these pieces of meat, these beef cheeks, are quite, they're cold, right? So they're pretty firm. If we have any like edges like that, you don't want them sticking up. You don't want them to burst your pastry when you put it on top. Leftover pie mix, leftover pastry mix. Go jump over to my short form content now. There'll be a recipe of how to use it up. Now we've got our grated cheese, which we want across the whole top. We've got a simple egg wash, just 1 egg beaten. Make sure there's no bits hanging over the sides, and then just brush around the outside, just to help us get a good seal on this. we got our piece of pastry here. Just gonna roll over our rolling pin and over our pie. Make sure we're pretty well centered. Find the edge of your pie tin and push down. We just want to trim around the outside, leaving a little bit, about 1/2 centimeter over the edge of the tin. So the edge of my tin finishes here. We just want about 1/2 centimeter thicker. It's going to give us some room for crimping. First step is to go around and just push the two pieces of pastry together. It's really important that we get a nice tight seal. And if you come across a part that you've left a bit too much, just trim it a little bit more. I like kind of a bit of a bigger crust. I kind of like that like crusty bit at the end when you finish your piece of pie. So I leave quite a bit of extra on there. Maybe not that much though, Andy. So there's a couple of ways you can crimp this. You can just use a fork and go around, or you can do this technique here. I'm gonna try and do it backwards, which might be my detriment, but it should help you guys. So you push it up and over. It's pretty crumbly at the moment, but we're trying to get fingered divots like that. So take your thumb, push both pieces over and push down firmly. We'll go back around in a second and tidy that up. But what we're looking for is these little ridges. Okay, so that's one pass. We're gonna go back around. We're just gonna firmly use our thumbs just to tidy those little ridges up. It's also pretty common to use puff pastry on the top of meat pies like this, which is certainly an option. Just make half the amount of short puff pastry, and I suggest just buying some puff pastry. Puff pastry is a pain to make. All right, egg wash the top, and then make sure you get all those crimps. So I've got my oven set to 190 degrees, but that's because it's a fancy commercial oven that has convection, so they kind of cook a bit faster. At home, I'll be using a 200 degree fan force oven, or 110 degrees if you don't have fan force. Because our meat's cooked, we're just trying to cook the pastry, and we want like lots of nice color. Only last thing we need to do is to cut across in the top, and that just allows steam to come out once that meat starts bubbling away. If you don't do that, you're gonna run the risk of getting soggy pastry. I'm gonna chuck this back in the fridge though. Oh, it's got some weight to it. In the fridge though, for kind of 10 minutes. We just want this pastry temperature to come down. If it goes in the oven too warm, the butter's gonna melt too quick, so we want the pastry to be nice and cold. 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever you like, in the fridge, and then we'll go in the oven. So 15 minutes later, our oven's nice and hot. In it goes. 20, 25 minutes, maybe 30, depending on your oven. We're looking for fully cooked pastry and a nice golden dark color. Whoa, it's hot. It actually took about 35 minutes, but it looks good. All right, we've rested it for 10 minutes. We're gonna try and cut a slice out. Time to taste. It's gonna be hot. So good. The crunchy pastry, creaminess of that cheese and the smokiness of the cheese and that tender meat. Doesn't get much better than that. Well, there you go. Don't forget, go chat to your butcher about getting beef cheeks. See if they can trim them for you and talk to them about other secondary cuts. They're a wealth of knowledge, and the secondary cuts are often where the most tasty pieces of meat are. Huge thank you to Australian Beef for sponsoring this video. Like this video if you took anything from it. Subscribe if you're not, and we'll see you next week for another recipe. Peace.